Get ready to rumble as I reveal how America got royally rumped by Republicans as Reagan rose to relevance to reign supreme as the right's undisputed universal champion. It's the final chapters, the end of an era, as I'm deconstructing how America got so culturally and socially divided, and the playbook used by key figures from the mid-20th century to today. A dark playbook that was the strategy, the art of American political war, which has brought us to the brink of another civil war. This is a story of attitude, ruthless aggression, reality, and a deliberate dumbing down and numbing down of America by the likes of Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, and Vince McMahon. Yeah, I said Vince McMahon, the wrestling guy. While we might argue that's a limited reference a large segment of my audience won't appreciate, by the end of this, you'll see that Vince McMahon had a much bigger part to play in all this than you might have realized. Even bigger than maybe even he realized. We'll find out how Ronald Reagan set the stage for these men to succeed, how he lowered the bars of excellence, lowered our standards, regulations, restrictions, and protections, all in the name of small government. But meanwhile, opened the floodgates for men like Murdoch to become multimedia moguls, manipulating our messaging, narcissistically dictating our narratives. For profit. Reagan's actions opened the floodgate for men like Donald Trump to succeed, or try in business, and continue to appear successful despite repeatedly not succeeding. Reagan Playbook, Chapter 1. Reagan's actions blew apart the media regulations that would have protected children from being targeted directly by men like Vince McMahon, who only saw his audience as potential revenue streams where the sole goal was to extract as much out of their wallets as possible by any means necessary. That was the playbook of Ronald Reagan. I mean, there's more to it than just that. Or why else would you watch the rest, right? This is a really long episode, trust me. I'm not just talking for my own sake here. There's more than just squeeze them for profit. But I mean, that is a pretty big chunk of it. Spoiler, I guess. And welcome to the podcast. Golden Age, the New Generation era, the Attitude era, the Ruthless Aggression era, the PG era, the Reality era. Sure, these are Vince McMahon's eras of professional wrestling and world wrestling entertainment, but these descriptions could just as easily describe America. The Golden Age was a time when wrestling was steeped in toxic stereotypes and problematic tropes. But no one really minded. That was the atmosphere of the time. America was toxic stereotypes and problematic tropes. We weren't as concerned with hurt feelings as we were with the entertainment factor. The joke just had to be funny. The biggest star of this era was Ric Flair, whose entire persona was being better than everyone else and letting them know it, living the lavish lifestyle everyone would envy. Flair was the heel, but secretly, you kind of wanted that life. The face of that generation was another bleach blonde spray-tanned hulk of a man with a handlebar mustache. Hulk Hogan rose to fame fighting against Asian, Middle Eastern, or Russian heels. Here, we have America's early 20th century, fighting against Asian, Middle Eastern, and Russian heels. While, of course, draped in an American flag with a gold cross around our necks, slapping our biceps, calling them pythons, while barking at the kids to work hard, say your prayers, and eat your vitamins, brother. Hulkamania back then was Americamania. America beat the foreign heel, the German bad guy. Well, actually, Hitler took himself out of the ring for a countout, but still, we won. The flip side of that was that overindulgence and wasteful privilege of feather, boa-clad robes, jewel-encrusted rings, and that lavish extravagance of the haves amidst the stock market struggles of the early 20th century. Well, then comes the new generation era. In wrestling, it's the rise of Bret the Hitman Hart, one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time. Also, many of the legends of the Golden Age fled to other promotions, making way for fresh names like Shawn Michaels, The Undertaker, Scott Hall's Razor Ramon, and Kevin Nash's Diesel. Also, wrestling took a significant downturn toward the back end of this era with the steroid scandal, which altered the industry thereafter. Well, now this seems like a nice pairing with the New Deal era for America. Coming out of all the celebration of the golden era, the new generation had new plans for America. The juiced up prosperity of the New Deal led many people to bounce back from the failure of American capitalism and lead America into the next era. Bret Hart, he was a champion for the people, whether he was tag teaming with Jim the Anvil Neidhart or even as a singles champ. Forcing a tap out by twisting somebody's legs in almost a figure four leg lock and then flipping him over for a sharpshooter. Bret Hart oozed cool confidence without being overly arrogant to the point of being unlikable. And Bret Hart could do a promo, tell the audience what he would do to his opponent, and end the whole thing with, "I'm the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be." How could a man claim such a thing and still be humble enough for people to love him? Bret was Canadian, unlike Hulk Hogan, who wore his Americanism literally like a costume. Go Google Mr. America. Bret wasn't waving his flag in the matches until the story warranted a heel turn later on in another era. His babyface persona wasn't about that. His heroism wasn't about America or a country. It was just about Bret Hart's pure technical wrestling, pursuing greatness and beating anyone who got in his way of the championship belt. Kind of like Franklin Roosevelt, who had that confidence to bust open the doors of Washington, tell him how he was going to govern, and then governing in a way that made people forget he was a dick about it. But just like with everything else, that pendulum swings, and swings hard. The Attitude Era, Part 1, which lasted a long time for America, but only about a decade for wrestling, began just the same in both instances, with a giant screw job. The Montreal Screwjob was the moment Vince McMahon turned on the champion that kept his promotion afloat after the steroid scandal in favor of the bad boy who would take them into the future. I covered this in the New World Order of Ethical Ambiguity, and I'll cover it a little more later, but in Bret Hart's match against Shawn Michaels at the 1997 Survivor Series, Vince McMahon ordered the referee to end the match on submission. The Heartbreak Kid got the Hitman into his own finishing submission move, Bret's move, the sharpshooter. Well, Bret never tapped out. He never submitted. Go watch the tape. The ref called the match almost immediately when the move was applied. Shawn Michaels was shocked. Hart was so furious, he spit in Vince's face. Bret's contract was up, and his understanding was that he would be allowed to leave the WWE as champion. Vince's ego wouldn't allow Bret to vacate the title without a loss and then just move on. Sort of wrestling ethics to transfer the title with dignity, so Vince McMahon schemed to sully the Hitman's long and glorious ride in the biggest promotion in wrestling. To this day, the debate is whether it was all a setup and who was in on it, but Bret Hart remains pretty vigilant in his frustration over the incident. And even as kayfabe fades in the sport somewhat, the Montreal Screwjob goes down as a shift from the usual cheating by the wrestlers and ineptitude by the refs to the corruption of the refs and the cheating by the owner of the company. Vince was writing the script, and the audience could now see the man behind the wizard's curtain. What fans didn't see was that Bret was leaving the WWE for their rival, WCW. But Bret had a little creative control of his contract and wanted to go out the champ. But the owner of the company went back on his word and took out the Hitman his way. What fans also didn't see was that Shawn Michaels, throughout his career, played the heel or the arrogant boy toy, but he was also quite influential backstage. The Heartbreak Kid had a reputation for locker room politics, influencing who stayed, who went, who got a push, who went over. Basically, who made it and who didn't. Shawn's fingerprints have been all over creative decisions since those early days. Similar to Harry S. Truman. America didn't see what the Democratic Party did to Henry A. Wallace in FDR's fourth and final election. The media was just print and broadcast back then, and many weren't aware of the scheming and what that collusion meant for we the people. We, the working class people. Let us not forget, too, that Republicans were also involved in conspiring to remove Wallace and prop up Truman in that election. In fact, it might be argued that Harry Truman was the corporate compromise for Republicans, since everybody knew FDR would win that election and die soon after. Thus, selecting Roosevelt's heir apparent for that election was more an unofficial coronation. Many might wonder what would have happened if the hitman was allowed to end things on his terms. Just like with Henry A. Wallace and the what if we faced in 1944 when the Washington powers that be decided America needed a different path forward, one that wasn't as humanist, hokey, or nice as Henry A. Wallace. We needed a little more attitude to finish the job of World War II and rebuild our economy after, they thought. If Wallace wouldn't drop the power bomb, who would? If Wallace wanted to continue and expand New Deal legislation that might cut into some profits and benefit the working class, then who wouldn't? America needed to usher in the Attitude Era. Just like with Vince ousting the confident but humble hitman for the arrogant and bombastic boy toy Shawn Michaels, America did so with a heel that became an American hero. Racist and genocidal maniac Harry S. Truman. Like Michaels, who wasn't a hero either, Truman's brash brand of politics and mannerisms were bold in a contrast to Wallace's, even Roosevelt's. Toward the end, Roosevelt was sickly, not in the public eye as much, like Woodrow Wilson 2 decades earlier. Truman would be able to lead as vice president until Roosevelt passed away, which everyone in the know knew was coming soon. They wouldn't have stood for Wallace being president. Neither party, with Wallace having never actually won any election of any kind, not to mention his commitment to increase the prosperity of the American worker. And just like this era saw the iconic hero Bret Hart's pink and black attack give way to D-Generation X's suck it gesture, Hulk Hogan was full-on Hollywood, and so was America. Basked in the full-on nationalism of post-World War II red, white, and blue patriotic propaganda, America surged forward thanks to that previous era of prosperity. Continued some of those storylines, but blazed a path forward of an attitude the world hadn't seen before. This America was united, and united behind the brazen arrogance of victory. We saved the world, remember? Remember how Japan was just taking over the Pacific and Germany had dominated Europe until we rode in on our very white horse and saved everybody? Remember? Well, history is written by the victors. Sure, America had our part in ending World War II, which shouldn't be diminished, but we often forget that World War II wasn't a World War II until Pearl Harbor, when we joined and made it a world war. Before that, it was just empirical skirmishes and seizures of lands by force in other lands that weren't America. So it couldn't be a world war if we weren't in it, right? We are the world, remember? It was atrocities of humanity, genocide, and murder for conquest. This was 20th century peoples having the benefit of every bit of history and knowledge before them, their own included, and still choosing to destroy one another. Until America intervened and destroyed them, remember? We the people remember, because the Attitude Era was all about building up this sense of national pride, patriotism, which can quickly be exploited and manipulated into nationalism, which leads directly to fascism. Do not pass go. Certainly do not collect $200. The Attitude Era was the era of pledges of loyalty, servitude to the collective, standing for anthems, worship of icons, flags, graven images, trophies, if you will, matter more than the actual people you're there to serve. It was choosing sides. You're either in or you're out. You're an American or you're a commie. Nothing stands in the way of the narrative. And that narrative is that there is a new world order, friends. And that new world order was America. We won. And now we were the head of the table. Remember? American nationalism was raw, and raw was war. It was the WWF versus the WCW, and by the end of this era, guess what? The WWF not only won, they ended and then acquired their competition. Like a child who cops too much attitude with you and is just allowed to keep expressing themselves with no accountability, well, this naturally led to the ruthless aggression era, which honestly was the absolute most hardcore period where we just laid it all out on the table. Table matches, pun intended, literally throwing your opponent through those big wooden folding tables, metal frames and all. Ruthless. Cage matches, coffin matches. Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. Buried alive. And when it came to toxicities like misogyny, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, all the stereotypes Vince McMahon set the standard and got rich on, this era saw these themes grow to their heights. Or depths. Perspective. In fact, as far as stereotypes go, this ruthless aggression era for America, part one anyway, became one of more foreign wars and oppression of the people. This lasted a bit longer for America than the 6 difficult years in professional wrestling. However, the WWF had to change their identity to WWE during their ruthless aggression era. They did so under the arrogant guise of, "Get the F out." It was our decision, since we're bigger than just a World Wrestling Federation. We're World Wrestling Entertainment. And everybody went, woo, with the change, when in fact, the World Wildlife Fund sued them for using WWF, which belonged to the World Wildlife Fund. Narcissism dictates its own narrative. For America, this narrative was that we saved the world, and save it we would continue to do through the wars in Korea, Vietnam, and many other skirmishes and meddlings throughout the globe. We were the heroes, and they were the heels. Whomever they needed to be. This era, post-World War II until the mid-70s, was filled with us versus a revolving door of them, and pitting America against every commie foe who opposed us. We were a little rougher around the edges, too. As Hulk Hogan gave way to Bret Hart and Hart got screwed and Shawn Michaels took the mantle, Shawn shared the stage for the ruthless aggression era with Triple H. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, whose previous incarnation saw him as a Connecticut blue blood wealthy upper-class elite who looked down on everyone. The Alphabet Soup superstar took it to the next level, with D-Generation X now fading from the black and neon green marketed, testosterone-pandering bro-dude shtick to a new game. A game of true, unadulterated pain. It was time for the most ruthless aggression we had ever seen. It was time to play the game. The ruthless aggression era saw hardcore come to the main event. Not that mainstream professional wrestling hadn't been hardcore all along. The Attitude Era deserves mention, of course. The ruthless aggression era and the Attitude Era sort of blend together, intertwine, because the latter couldn't have existed without the former. In fact, among the eras of professional wrestling, only these two are codependent on one another. In that, wrestling could have skipped straight over these two eras altogether, and the overall audience vibe, the cultural vibe, wouldn't have changed much. One might argue that it was inevitable that professional wrestling would eventually become this anyway, just from the visceral and violent nature of the sport. We'll never know. They went there and stayed there for years, until they couldn't any longer. Similar to America's attitude and ruthless aggression eras, parts 1, respectively. Now, hardcore got the mass-produced, mass appeal, over-the-top, controversial corporate Vince McMahon treatment. McHardcore. These eras were when the limits were pushed to the brink, and the end of the ruthless aggression era to disaster. The attitude and ruthless aggression eras for America saw some of our most hardcore moments. Civil rights, Assassinations, protests, movements, riots, wars, the death of beloved figures, the beginnings of division, and the Hollywood influence hit its hard. For wrestling, America saw the Montreal Screwjob for what it was. Vince McMahon, no longer just a ringside announcer and silent, impartial owner of the company, was now a full-on heel in the storyline. The boss himself was so corrupt and so ego-driven, he had to be the star of his own franchise, and the fans loved it. He had an affair with Trish Stratus while his wife was in a wheelchair. Oh, they went low. The Rock, the literal epitome of attitude, grew to new heights heading for Hollywood. Chris Jericho, Batista, Randy Orton, Goldberg. These names jump out as figures of this era, each of them known for arrogance, attitude, and ruthless aggression. The beginnings of division were sown with the us versus them of the Attitude Era. Us against the rest of the world if they don't join us. You're either with us or against us. Whether that was WWE versus WCW, or within the WCW with the NWO versus everyone else. But when that ended with the big corporate boss crushing the competition and burying their brands, it was no longer about us versus them. Them was now us. The New World Order had come to us now, and it was us versus us. Just like with the split of Raw and SmackDown during this era, this was an us versus us fight that translated into our living rooms. Also during this era, protests, movements, and civil rights were coming to the forefront of the debate on professional wrestling's cultural impact, as we saw some of the most tragic outcomes from the darkest side of the ring. The steroid trials ending the New Generation era set off a domino effect in the way athletes trained, prepared, and were managed in the business. It changed all of the business. More scrutiny and attention was paid to stars and whether they juiced to stay at the top. Steroid use wasn't good for any sport. It wasn't good for the athletes or the fans. Look, roided out muscle mutts didn't wrestle well, but Vince McMahon had a kink with bodybuilders. His fascination was with men's physique over their talent and personality. See Hulk Hogan. Just to name one. When the boss is a size queen, you gotta juice up to get seen. By the time the ruthless aggression era started, many of those wrestlers, like Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig, Eddie Guerrero, Crash Holly, Brian Crush Adams, Bam Bam Bigelow, Hawk the Road Warrior, Hercules Hernandez, Brian Pillman, Chris Candido, the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, the Big Boss Man, and even Miss Elizabeth succumbed to substance abuse or other tragic early ends related to the rigors of the ring. All of them 47 years or younger. My age in this episode, or younger. America was talking about the cost of professional wrestling for the first time. In some cases, the superstar wasn't the only collateral damage. Chris Benoit, whose name is now almost all but erased from World Wrestling Entertainment's history, murdered his wife and child, then killed himself in 2007. This rocked all of professional sports, the world. But it put the issues of this entertainment in public spectacle and debate. Benoit had been one of the top stars at that time, multiple championships. However, addiction, brain injuries, mental illness, and other factors likely mixed together to form a combustible combo that turned tragedy for all involved. The pendulum swings and swings hard, so it must swing just as hard to overcorrection. Not to make anywhere near light of this tragedy, but merely to compare it for the sake of the theme. One might think that the assassinations of Kennedy, King, or Malcolm X might have been the catalyst for change from ruthless aggression, but in fact, America simply wasn't ready for the change dictated by tragedy. At least give Vince McMahon a bone for at very least acknowledging he had no other choice but to shift the thematic gears. No, it wasn't assassinations that pushed us over to a new era in America. What Richard Nixon did to America and the integrity of the White House was pretty similar to the impact of the steroid scandal fallout, the public display of the ramifications of the corruption in headline after headline, and then the culmination of that in the most tragic ending of an era. Wrestling, for all its struggles, had to shift gears. Again, without sounding flip, Chris Benoit was the natural consequence for Vince McMahon's greed. Chris Benoit was exactly the personification of Vince McMahon's ruthless aggression. His exploitive and greed-driven, narcissistic and sociopathic devolution of the American public, his own customer base for the sake of ratings, relevance, and revenue, with no regard for the consequences for anyone involved. What did we think was going to happen? When the most negative and toxic traits are amped up, juiced up, and oiled up on display with catchy theme music, spotlights, fireworks, and cool pyrotechnics, and all that's designed to make people's brains react in certain ways. It's a Clockwork Orange, and we're just expecting all involved to get up out of that chair and carry on like nothing happened? Nope. Sorry. That story always ends with somebody fucking losing their ever-loving minds. Just like Chris Benoit. Professional wrestling had pushed the boundaries of social standards on television and live events too. It wasn't safe to take a child to a WWE event anymore. Psychologically speaking, damaging. Wrestling wasn't for kids during this time, but was still highly marketed to them. Then, with everyone's attention on the sport asking, is all this necessary to tell a story and have dudes hug and slap each other? Vince McMahon had to change the narrative. Overnight. Enter the PG era. The necessary evil by Vince McMahon's outlandish standards. A nicer fighting entertainment media. The extreme hardcore wrestling brand would be killed off. Things would have to be a little nicer from here on out. McMahon had pushed the envelope too far, and people paid the ultimate price. McMahon had one hope to succeed as the wrestling business hemorrhaged during this era. Be slightly less toxic than before. But who would lead during this new era? The age of the anti-hero had begun. Ideas of a Captain America or a Superman seemed unbelievably hokey and boring. America no longer wanted a hero to be a role model, someone to aspire to be like. That was work. It made us feel bad. We needed easy. We've been trained to find heroes we could identify with because they were flawed as we were. In fact, they were more flawed and successful, so we, in fact, could lower our bars of acceptability, loyalty, and ethics. How does America reset back to wholesome and healthy egg whites and turkey bacon for breakfast after hogging out on box after box of sugar-enriched frosting-blasted Diabetos for 2 decades? Having already turned face again, leaving the NWO behind, as most fans already had, the aging Hulk Hogan story had come full circle back to the yellow and red Hulkamania. But Hogan was old, a relic from a bygone era. Fans had grown up and just weren't into the whole say your prayers, take your vitamins, and be good little Hulkamaniacs anymore. Bret Hart was retired by Goldberg's foot to the face. Shawn Michaels was on his way out, soon to be retired by The Undertaker. Triple H had risen to the top with an abundance of abusive aggression, but also by marrying Vince McMahon's daughter Stephanie, coming to his own full circle for the entitled Prince of Privilege character. The Prince of Pain changed the game and became the owner's son-in-law. Kayfabe and otherwise. Plenty of stars during this era, but none quite suitable to be Superman. Sure, you had all the names we've come to root for from previous eras, those anti-heroes we knew and loved, but after all, who is actually a true, pure face in the business anymore? Who is a hero in wrestling who isn't flawed? Everybody's got a price. And most everybody cashes in. The R-rated superstar Edge and his cocky cohort Christian Cage. The old standby Undertaker, he's dead man though. Batista, Randy Orton. The Rock comes back from the movies, but while The Rock can carry a hero's mantle in Hollywood, he's much better suited for a little more badness in the squared circle. Now, what I'm about to talk about is like conspiracy level alpha, because I'm going to talk about a star you've never even seen before as the biggest name of this era of wrestling. You may have never seen him, but I assure you, he's America's hero during this period, and he was the golden boy Vince McMahon needed. The only problem was you can't see him. John Cena was the poster boy of the PG era, the nice guy who finished last until he came back to finish first. For America, we needed a nice guy to come back from the horrors of Vietnam and the protests that took place during the previous era. The Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras were long and arduous for America. We went through a lot. America was divided, at home, abroad, in every way. You were a proud patriot who supported our troops. Or you questioned why the hell we were there in the first place getting our asses handed to us. Plus, this era, the Ruthless Aggression era, was one where we saw the harshest realities up close and personal like never before, broadcast on the morning, noon, evening, and nightly news. It was across every paper, every headline, TV, film, music, every bit of our media was influenced by what was happening at home and overseas. We were exhausted in every imaginable way. America's Ruthless Aggression era had ended in the most unceremonious of ways, humiliatingly so, with our corruption and the consequences of allowing that level of corruption exposed, with Richard Nixon resigning in shame. A criminal, un-American traitor, and overall heel, Richard Nixon was pardoned by his vice president and successor, Gerald Ford, having never been held accountable for his actions. Gerald Ford would be held accountable, though, losing the 1976 election to America's John Cena nice guy, Jimmy Carter. Well, the issue with Jimmy Carter is you could see him, and he just wasn't all that presidential. He was a good man. He was a nice man. He was experienced and could certainly do the job, except he wasn't corrupt enough to keep the job. Carter wasn't willing to do what it took to win in Washington. Carter was trying to do things the right way, by our procedures, by the constitutional limitations of his power, and by his own moral and spiritual considerations. And with some sabotagingly shitty advice from his advisors. In fact, unlike professional wrestling, where John Cena excelled as a nice guy because wrestling didn't have a choice and wrote it that way, American politics isn't all scripted and has no place for a babyface like Jimmy Carter. In fact, our PG era hit us so hard, it barely lasted 2 years, if it ever actually started at all. And then almost like a board game, we landed on the wrong space and we had to jump back 10 spaces. Why? Because history repeats. If you let it. We let it. History is a funny thing. By funny, I mean completely devoid of humor, but certainly fascinating in a way that makes you chuckle helplessly as you start to see the patterns emerging from humankind's own daft arrogance. Not funny, haha. Funny, terrifying to the point your brain laughs out of self-preservation. In Vince McMahon's extremist entertainment world of professional wrestling, superstar Chris Benoit's double murder-suicide and the fallout that ensued, combined with the blowback of the steroid scandal and, well, the many, many deaths of popular pro wrestlers in the 90s, all under 50 years old, by the way, created a necessity to whitewash the sport, Control, Alt, Delete, and reboot that sucker in safe mode. I'm not saying it was all clean, but certainly cleaned up, quite a bit from the previous two eras. This PG era needed to be a little more family-friendly and set the industry on a different path. McMahon knew that. He also knew that cash cow pandering to the most despicable and deplorable aspects of humanity for ratings, revenue, and relevance was over. For now. He'd pushed the line too far, and that line murdered his wife and child and then killed himself. Gone were the extreme storylines of old and back to just vanilla milquetoast rivalries and stories that weren't about Eddie Guerrero telling 8-year-old Dominic Mysterio that he was the father, Kane physically and sexually assaulting, then forcing Lita to marry him against her will in the ring, Brock Lesnar threatening a pregnant woman, Stone Cold urinating on Arn Anderson, Shawn Michaels urinating live on television in a drug test, or D-Generation X doing blackface. That all really happened. Wrestling desperately needed a reset from all that. After all, let's what if for a moment and think about if Chris Benoit hadn't Pop Goes the Weaseled. What then? How more extreme would Vince McMahon have taken his entertainment? Then, who would have Pop Goes the Weaseled? Because we can all agree that was the inevitable price to pay for the pace they were going. This forced reset would bring a different, more babyface-friendly vibe for the next 5 years for wrestling to try and right the ship for fans. Fans predictably got bored with John Cena, the watered-down stories, rivalries, and matches. With his star rising in Hollywood like The Rock's, WWE's pure white bread obsession with the unseen Cena was dwindling. Daniel Bryan, who also wrestles under Bryan Danielson, beat John Cena for the championship to begin the reality era. Cena was a heavyweight in every sense of the term. Bryan was a lightweight, but a hard-working fan favorite. The little guy with the big beard won the fans, won the title, and changed the brand. The reality era for wrestling was one where storylines stretched kayfabe for the first time. In fact, this was a natural progression of the consequences of the Benoit tragedy. Vince McMahon almost had to come out and say, okay, some of this is kind of put on, kind of fake, a little. Storylines of real families, contract disputes, life away from the ring, and real backstage drama boiling over to the surface became the new norm. Stars like Bryan and the raw, gritty Chicago street kid CM Punk, Dean Ambrose, who would go on to become Jon Moxley, and the rise of a stable of female wrestlers called the Four Horsewomen, led by Ric Flair's daughter Charlotte, dominated the era. These women were a far departure from their divas counterparts of eras gone by when women's wrestling in the WWE was degraded to little more than an excuse for the audience to see women in bikinis rolling around on the mat together in a popcorn match. A match nobody cares about, so it's time to go get snacks. That certainly isn't the case today, but pre-PG era, women in wrestling were a sexy sideshow to the real sport for many. The reality era saw fans clamoring for more of what they wanted and less of the forced storylines written by washed-up former wrestlers. In fact, the reality era also saw WWE venturing into reality television with a show called Total Divas, which blended a reality show that still sort of played with kayfabe. Following that, the international era, which saw non-American stars like Canadian Brock Lesnar, Finn Balor, Kevin Owens, and more come into relevance. For most of these stars from the other lands, this was a time when their nationality wasn't a guaranteed stereotype shtick or definitive of their persona. Some, like Sheamus or Drew McIntyre, play up their heritage, but isn't it cartoonish in a way like previous eras were? Nor was being non-American a guarantee that one would be anti-American. In fact, the international era would see such an influx of global talent, and good global talent, that the traditional Hulk Hogan versus Iron Sheik Yokozuna, Nikolai Volkov, fill-in-the-blank foreign jobber rivalries just seemed campy and oversold. Post-reality era, fans wanted something a little more real. The reality is, patriotism just isn't as big now as it was then, and it doesn't play as well in an us versus them scenario when the country is facing down an actual civil war. I'm going to credit Ernest Wilkins of Office Hours on the last era here because it's an unofficial era, but he had a great name for this side-by-side comparison I'm doing. The Too Big to Fail era, which began the day after my birthday in 2019. This is an era where not only the WWE was too big to fail, as they had proven after the Benoit tragedy, after the struggles of the steroid controversy, and then they'd continue to prove through the COVID pandemic's audience-free Thunderdome matches. Wrestling as a sport had proven too big to fail as it grew and expanded internationally, with multiple promotions garnering success and big-name signings to their respective rosters. The Too Big to Fail era also applied to the superstars who won the gold, who were also too big to fail. This era is known for the emergence of the first real competition for WWE since WWE bought their competition. All Elite Wrestling rose to relevance on the backs of some former WWE stars like Chris Jericho, CM Punk, Bryan Danielson, Daniel Bryan, and the American Nightmare Cody Rhodes. WWE's developmental brand, NXT, also took off during this most recent era, becoming their third branded division behind Raw and SmackDown. The rise of international and even some growing American independent circuits has also helped the sport grow into what many are hoping becomes a second golden age. The too big to fail. Champions. Long title reigns, too. Well, pun intended there. Roman Reigns, who not only unified the WWE title and the new Universal Championship, but was champion for several years. He unified those titles by beating the seemingly unbeatable Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania in 2022. Since then, teams like Reigns' stablemates, the Usos, who unified the Raw and SmackDown tag titles, were, until WrestleMania 2023, undisputed tag team champs, and had been for a while. Long title belt runs from Bianca Belair, Charlotte Flair, The New Day, and Gunther, who held the NXT UK Championship for 870 days. His women's wrestling counterpart, Kaylee Ray, held the female equivalent belt for nearly 650 days. The WWE wanted stars to shine, for sure, and shine for a very long time. During this era, if you won a championship, you earned it. Following America's attitude and ruthless aggression eras, America would try to reset with a PG era with the election of Jimmy Carter. America was ready for a fresh start with a nice guy to lead us. Now, the issue was Ronald Reagan wasn't the champion. He was champion of California, but he wanted the undisputed world championship. And that was being held by Nixon's former tag mate, Gerald Ford, after Nixon left in shame. Ron challenged Ford for the title in 1976 in the primary, but lost in that match for the chance to face Jimmy Carter at Election Mania 1976. This was a tumultuous period for America, who had attempted to go with the nicest candidate we could with Carter. However, what America didn't see was the meddling backstage on both sides. Reagan wanted an end to Nixonian politics and wanted Ford out. This was the right time, as the overall vibe in America was leaning conservative. Republicans knew a win in 1976 would be difficult, with economic instability, global unrest, and social, economic, and cultural concerns for the American working class coming home to roost. And Ford having pardoned the treasonous criminal Nixon. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was barely a dozen years in the past, with assassinations of key figures like John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, still fresh in everyone's memories. Still, Carter won the election, sweeping most of the South, the last time a Democrat would do that. For America, 1976 was an election of East and West. Carter won most of the East, with Ford winning everything left half on the map, except Texas and Hawaii. On the map, it looked close. Electoral College, Carter 297 to Ford's 240. But a look into the states that Ford won show many of those were close victories, like California, which Ford won by plurality, not majority. 1.78% difference in those 45 Electoral College votes. Looking at a 342 to 195 landslide would have been a mandate against Republican politics. Illinois, Reagan's home state, won by Gerald Ford by fewer than 93,000 votes. That's 26 delegates. A 368 to 169 landslide would have been humiliating for Republicans. Michigan's 21 delegates would be fewer than 200,000 votes from Carter. 389 to 148. That's an electoral bloodbath, folks. I'm sure I could do the same for close calls in some of the states that went blue, but that's not the story of 1976. The story of 1976 isn't most of America wanting to give Republicans another shot at ruining our country. It was a conservative-leaning society needing anybody to lead us out of that. Most Americans, fed up with Watergate, corrupt conservatives, and the domestic as well as global instabilities, were looking for any reason not to vote Republican. This election wasn't as close as the 1,678,069 popular votes and 57 Electoral College numbers reflected. Still, it was that close because Democrats had been damaged nationally by forcing the Civil Rights Act down most of America's throats, the god-awful disaster that was the Vietnam War, and other factors. While America was looking for any reason not to vote Republican again, if that reasoning didn't prove to be solid, those middle-of-the-road voters that Democrats are still clamoring for today would swing back right the next election. America tried to usher in a PG era, but it failed miserably thanks to the Republican establishment, recognizing their reign had ended. America wouldn't keep going in that direction, so the conservatives accepted their loss, secretly rallied behind their up-and-coming star in Ronald Reagan, crowned him the heir apparent to the party, and then began deliberately setting the stage for Carter's failures. Obstructionism, which had really come into full bloom under Nixon, was now the daily practice of conservatives in Washington. Our way or the highway, take what we offer you or we shut the government down and make it look like you did it for failing to give us what we want. It should be noted that Gerald Ford resisted the urge to cash out post-presidency, turning down job offers and corporate board seats that would have compromised his ethics, holding out for a 1980 rematch with Carter. The issue with that was that nobody wanted Ford to run but Ford. Constitutionally, he could have run in 80, but an 84 term wouldn't have been possible. Republicans were playing the long game from the playbook of Reagan and Nixon. They weren't interested in offering the job to a one-term pony, not just to anybody, much less anybody who couldn't take them through the 1980s. For that, they needed a dream ticket of conservatism. Ford-Reagan wasn't the ticket. Reagan wouldn't play second fiddle to Ford. For that, Republicans had turned to Bob Dole in 1976. Reagan, following his primary loss, waited in the wings, manipulating and weaseling his way into the party elite's ears, preparing for his eventual coronation. How did Carter beat Ford in 1976? Pay attention, because that's in the playbook too. Sure, Washington corruption, Watergate, global wars and instability, Watergate, lots of issues preyed on the minds of the American voters across the ideological spectrum. Being fed up with where we were at was the great unifier. In fact, Jimmy Carter should have been the candidate to unify America. Seeing as a liberal, he was hardly liberal by today's standards, but even by the standards of the 70s. A devout Christian, Carter was a conservative Democrat, but a man of ethics and morals who believed in human rights. So Republicans wouldn't have touched him with a 10-foot pole, even if he did run as a Republican candidate. Still, many of Carter's policies should have been something that conservatives could compromise behind. They didn't. It wasn't about policy or what was good for America. It was about which letter was in parentheses by their name. All Republicans took the fall for Nixon. Voters, Americans, they supported him. They put him there knowing he was corrupt, with a lot of Americans protesting against Nixon, telling Americans Nixon was corrupt. Turning on Nixon would be admitting they were wrong. Nixon gave him that out. It wasn't that hard to denounce Dick after he got caught. But turning on their party would be, well, they might vote for a Democrat this time, but only if it's a conservative candidate. No progressives. Jimmy Carter had served his country as an officer in the United States Navy. The man was an engineer. He wasn't quite the simple peanut farmer he played on TV. But that hokiness that worked for Henry A. Wallace, appealing to middle America as one of them, paid off for Carter. Jimmy Carter branded himself as an honest man, pledging to never lie. A stark contrast to Republicans. It was an open and born-again Christian who ran on comprehensive welfare and healthcare reform, fighting sexism, racism, and poverty as his faith demanded. Carter promised a new tax plan and more prosperity for Americans as issues like inflation, the economy, and global instability were the headlines voters read daily. The PG era for America didn't last very long at all. America took a deep breath, finally shedding the shame of Nixon once and for all, but we're quickly reminded that things really sucked in America. The headlines didn't stop just because Nixon was gone and the war was over. Republicans could point at Carter and say, see, it's his fault. Straight from the playbook. That PG era America needed so badly, though, it wasn't PG at all. In fact, it was so raw, it served as a smackdown on both parties that set the stage for a Democratic convention cage match. Just like professional wrestling's bygone heyday, America's disregard for roiding up resulted in a boiling over of disastrous proportions. As the Chris Benoit tragedy reset things for Vince McMahon's sport, Nixon's Watergate scandal did the same for American politics. Almost. However, this wasn't a TV show with good athletes and bad actors. This was reality, with bad actors trying to be politicians. The writers for this show suck worse than the ones in the wrestlers' writing rooms. When America attempted a PG-era reset, trying to give the nice guy the championship belt, it backfired. It backfired big time. As it turns out, America wasn't PG and never had been. In fact, all the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras, parts 1 respectively, showed us is that Americans were always at our core ruthlessly aggressive with our attitudes. This culminated in these eras overlapping and skipping around. We crashed so hard, we bounced back a few eras, which I'll get to. First, Jimmy Carter was challenged at the Democratic Convention in 1980 by Ted Kennedy in a very ugly and contentious convention. I covered this in the very beginning of Overthinking Everything, so go give those a little more algorithm love for a refresher. It's to say that America's respective political establishments were just as amped up and divisive as the society represented by them. This, of course, was due to the volatile emotional stoking of the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras, parts 1, respectively. The 1972 election, where Nixon won re-election right before Watergate broke, his opponent was the very liberal senator from South Dakota, George McGovern. I know, with a name like McGovern, how could America not elect him? Racism. McGovern was for a lot of things America wasn't ready for, and Nixon spoke to the more traditional masses by not being himself in front of an open mic. He played the part, saved the N-words and the other slurs to closed conversation. Until he didn't. Nixon's playbook was stoking fears, pandering to his base's racism, sexism, bigotries, prejudices, while pushing a pro-corporate, anti-working class agenda Americans wouldn't hear because it was cloaked in fears of communism, socialism, and what happens if we let liberals run things. In fact, liberals hadn't run things since the mid-1940s when Roosevelt died. Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, and Carter, all moderates by today's standards. Most moderates by the standards of then. Roosevelt rubbed a lot of people raw in the way he governed. His progressive policies won over a lot of Americans, but the political establishment in Washington saw things much differently. Progressive politics works for we the people, but doesn't work well for the corporate one-percenters or the lifelong career politicians cashing out to turn multimillionaires. In fact, America hadn't seen true progressives in office since Roosevelt's, Franklin and Teddy, Democrat and Republican, respectively. Consider that. Since 1945, America has been a centrist to conservative-leaning nation. Economically, foreign policy, social policy, labor rights, civil and human rights, legislatively, in every sense except socially and culturally, America has been conservative-leaning. In that, we the people, by an overwhelming majority, support progressive ideals, but things dictated by people representing us lean conservative. Even the progress achieved has been minimal, what should have already been in the first place, or winning back something that once was but had been taken. Over 3/4 of a century. The 1940s was about scaring Americans away from socialism. The 1950s was the Red Scare of communism and Eisenhower's Lavender Scare, his homophobic policies and attitudes. The 1960s continued that anti-communist rhetoric with another round of good old American race baiting. By the 1970s, the communism rhetoric was really wearing on people, especially with us losing our ass in Vietnam. America was involved in the first place to prevent the spread of communism throughout Asia. Communism, like socialism, is an economic theory. They aren't capitalism. In fact, capitalism and communism could be seen as rivals were global economics like a wrestling match. This was, is, and always has been about money. Vietnam had been at war since 1954. Our involvement by the mid-1960s was at a time when American unions were being busted, broken up, and with a big push of anti-labor rhetoric ongoing. Corporations were paying big bucks to celebrities to give their workers rousing anti-union speeches. Those protests Reagan would sick the National Guard on later as the governor of California, anti-war protests, among many other issues. McGovern's election in 1972 would have shown Republicans America was not happy with their attempts to end Vietnam and might have ushered in a more progressive era of overall healing. This wasn't the PG era where John Cena smiled and waved. We weren't a PG people. America was at least PG-13 and would soon head straight to the rated R superstar, pushing us to the very edge. But Nixon won in 72, then almost immediately got taken down with Watergate. Ford wasn't Lyndon Johnson, he wasn't Harry Truman. Really, and whether it was Ford or just the atmosphere of the mid-70s, a reset was needed. Except that reset didn't take us back to the golden age. It jolted us right back to the new generation era. And hold on, because we're in for a ride, folks. This new generation era saw the sad mid-card has-been who couldn't win the championship but went off to manage other wrestlers in another independent circuit. He was now back in the ring, pushed over as the babyface of all babyfaces, a role Ronald Reagan was born to play. Gone were the Republicans who drove America down. Those Nixonian Republicans had lost their seats or sworn their loyalties over to the cult of Bonzo. Few dared stand in the way of making America great again. While the Democrats won in 1976, the next few years saw them tearing themselves apart at the seams for power, for survival. Again, the progressives, who had been politically abolished by the Democrats in 1948, were now with the Democrats fighting for their united interests while lobbying for more policies for we the people than corporate campaign contributors. Many saw continuing with Carter as a guaranteed Reagan presidency, while others felt it would be disrespectful and poor optics to unseat a sitting president with a new, fresh candidate. When it was clear Carter wouldn't step aside and allow true liberals to lead the way forward, plans began to do to Carter what the Democrats did to Henry A. Wallace. I'm not comparing Carter and Wallace in any way than the hapless, hokey humanist and in many ways gullible personas. Both were good men, policies aside, who weren't capable of being leaders in Washington. In a Washington so corrupt, good men can't succeed. This is the playbook. The Republicans, reeling from the loss in 76, would see several paths before them. Decorated, pedigreed, respected Republican and former director of the CIA, George Herbert Walker Bush, whose well-educated, experienced, and credentialed voice of conservative reason clashed against the suave yet bombastic former Hollywood Screen Actors Guild president and chimpanzee second fiddle Ronald Reagan. In debates, Bush was informed and knowledgeable. Reagan was an actor who played cowboy on his Hollywood ranch. Yeehaw! America loved it, and he played against the entitled, privileged blue blood secret society wealth very well. He learned from Carter. Focus groups tested through the roof for Reagan. With a landslide, America chose to win one for the Gipper and hand Ronnie the award he never could seem to be handed anywhere else, no matter how little he worked. The Republicans decided their 1 and 2 would run 1 and 2. The right was united, regardless of win or lose. Meanwhile, at the 1980 Democratic National Convention, Ted Kennedy, who never officially owned an Amphicar 770 but thought he did apparently, attempted a coup to unseat the sitting president. Meanwhile, by the general election, an actual coup was going on against the sitting president. The Democrats were eating their own. They tried to go PG with Jimmy Carter, but America was rejecting that hard pill to swallow. Carter was our peas and carrots. We were hooked on sugar, damn it! The new generation era of Reagan was a facade, though. There was no hero. It was all kayfabe. Reagan was right on par with Nixon, maybe better, maybe worse. Depends on your perspective. Some might argue that Nixon's ego and narcissism was the meticulous orchestrator of his own demise, while Reagan's daft, arrogant, narcissistic ego fooled him into believing he was the orchestrator of his own success. While Reagan got to trot out to the public and play the part, the real work was being done behind the scenes by those who are far too many to name, but this speaks to a breeding and growing fascist movement that's been present at least since the early 20th century. And when it was stamped out publicly and not exterminated properly, it went to nest, waiting for the right time to emerge. It ran in local city and county elections, school boards, banning books and classes. It rose through the ranks, masking itself as the moral majority. It cloaked its white supremacy in promises of prosperity if we could just keep America white again. For decades, it slowly brainwashed, indoctrinated, and gaslit its children and grandchildren with the ideas they were told to have at their non-union but required work meeting, where they got to see a movie star. Slowly and slowly, with each war fought being about money, but sold to the people as having patriotic motives, without ever having a storyline payoff. The running theme becomes patriotism, and every story has to keep stoking that fire. Well, that's how you breed nationalism. That is the playbook. As the new generation era faded, we're left with Newt Gingrich, one of those influential in the push of the Republicans further right, which I'll discuss more a bit next episode. Gingrich's brand of obstructionism was a more extreme version than even under Nixon's. Fit right into Reagan's Bulwarian take-it-or-leave-it style of bargaining. Reagan wasn't a tough guy. He was a clown, but he sure could play the tough guy. And people bought it. The Attitude Era. Part 2. Eagles, pledges, everything for America. We are the world. We save the universe. And nobody was a bigger megaphone than that than Ronald Reagan. Reagan couldn't be, he could act. So he made America look great and then said, see, I said make America great again, and we did. Look what I did. I made us great. Except just like every great pyramid scheme, the bottom is bound to fall out, just like a wrestler's announcer's desk at a pay-per-view event. And the pyramid scheme of Reaganomics did crumble, burying the American working class under the rubble. Meanwhile, as the Attitude Era raged on, a theme we'll revisit more on Overthinking Everything, it gave way to the Ruthless Aggression Era, Part 2, which very much ended up like wrestling's Attitude and Ruthless Aggression eras, where Vince McMahon bared ass on national television and would force his employees to literally kiss his ass for everyone to see. America got their own version of that in the 2016 election. Meanwhile, the pure shock of America's attempt at a PG era thrust us into some messed up multiverse where multiple eras overlap. While the Attitude Era and of the 80s and 90s is devolving into the Ruthless Aggression Era of everything after, there's also the Reality Era, which is really metaphorically perfect for this because it's almost like an alternate reality going on while reality is realitying. The Reality Era, where Rupert Murdoch blew out the fourth wall of infotainment media, and where Donald Trump, among so many others, violated that fourth wall of television entertainment, and where the fourth wall of business was dissolved, enough so that America, now fully dumbed down and numbed down enough to not know no better and not care even if they did, could see the business boardroom for what it was, in public, for the first time. For entertainment purposes only. But by normalizing the most deplorable behaviors in a professional setting, further lowering our ethical standards, our integrity, and our morals. Not religious morals, human morals. The playbook Reagan used to succeed is the same one used by Vince McMahon, Rupert Murdoch, and Donald Trump. When you can't win by the rules, 1, break the rules. If that doesn't work or someone gets caught, pivot. 2, find loopholes around those rules. If that doesn't work, pivot. 3, make new rules. And if that doesn't work, you didn't do enough to win. Next time, win. 4, make new rules. 5, make it so no one else gets to change or make new rules. 6, well, the issue is with this playbook, there is no 6. No one is watching your back. Someone's always there to try to take you out. Nixon didn't have a 6. Ford pardoned him because they were close friends. It was his career suicide. However, also note that a lot of Republicans still supported Nixon and felt he was perfectly within his power to try. He just shouldn't have gotten caught. Remember that. Nixon didn't have an out. Reagan lost his fucking mind before he could get an out. Within a few years after handing the reins to Bush, Bonzo would admit he was going bonkers. You can create your own conspiracy around exactly when he started losing his mind and who knew, covered it up so he could get reelected, and then bow out gracefully. That's on you, if you want to Bilderberg workshop that. Murdoch doesn't have an out. There is no end game with propaganda. Trump didn't have an out. McMahon didn't have an out. He was forced out. This is one reason the WWE is where it's at today, instead of where Vince McMahon was driving it. Sure, McMahon's very wealthy because of driving our culture into a caveman devolution, all for profit. Murdoch's wealthy on the empire of bigotry, hate, and lies and propaganda he built. Not even an American by birth, Murdoch brought America down from within, getting us to attack one another, turning on our brothers, all based on lies for profit. Trump's wealth has always been in question, but his successes and failures aside, following Reagan's playbook to a T, even stealing his slogan, Donald Trump failed to make America great again, but instead revealed what some have known all along. The dark, insidious nature was always among us and has been since the birth of this nation and before. The entitled narcissism and sociopathic disconnect from our compassion, empathy, and emotions, save rage, fear, anger, and hate. This is a human trait that is nature and nurture. Some are wired more aggressively, many more can be made that way. The deliberate lowering of our ethical and social standards of acceptability and accountability through entertainment media, information, and even education. Not necessarily school, but how we approach education for human beings as a society. We must understand that we are what we consume, in every manner of speaking. Some knew that. And that playbook, whether those using it to gain success knew it or not, had a much bigger and darker purpose. Now, with men forging the next path like Mark Zuckerberg in social media, Elon Musk for technology, Jeff Bezos for business and commerce, and Mark Cuban, the lone billionaire wolf who seems to want to wear sheep's clothing, one has to ask, where are the women and otherwise represented marginalized groups? Moreover, what path for us will these people choose? Zuckerberg had great power and chose to behave just as irresponsibly and exploitively as his predecessors. Bezos for workers' rights and the working class might hold a similar argument. We certainly see reflections of Thomas Edison's opportunistic con man in Elon Musk. Edison may not have led the nation from the White House, but he led in other ways. Rather, he couldn't. But he could exploit others and call it his success. This playbook is a lot of things, as you probably picked up on. But those things are some of the darkest aspects of humanity. The pursuit for power over others, greed, ruthless ambition, corruption, and an almost sociopathic narcissism, a disconnect from compassion, empathy, and a disregard for consequences. Sometimes the wizard chooses the wand. Sometimes the wand chooses the wizard. This playbook clearly chose its hosts. Coming up, it's the conspiracy of all conspiracies. And I'm just scratching the surface. This Create Your Own Conspiracy series up to now has been laying the claims for my hypothesis that it's all Reagan's fault. It's not that simple, but the dumbing down and numbing down of America was deliberate. And it helps to answer, how did we get here? The last 50 years since Reagan got elected pushed us toward a downward spiral of dumbitudinosity. It's what happened after that set us on this course for a socio-cultural division we haven't seen since the mid-1800s. Let's unravel our reality, step back from reasonability, leverage our logic, and scale back our scrutiny. Suspend disbelief, if you will, and let's just talk hypothetically. Because what I'm talking about in the Create Your Own Conspiracy finale could never happen in real life, right? It's surely a conspiracy theory, and just because this is honestly too whackers to even consider as real. So let's just imagine an Overthinking Everything what if episode. What I'm going to lay out here is going to blow your mind, and it'll race the hair on the back of your neck. And if you don't have any hair on the back of your neck, you go buy some Rogaine. It'll be worth it. Oh, if you thought the Reagan to Nixon to Reagan to Murdoch, McMahon, and Trump was a stretch for your imagination, well, limber up your logos, pragmatize your pathos, and exercise that ethos. I'm making all the arguments from all the angles and turning our pinky thinky blobs to oatmeal next as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Did that sound crazy? I was really going for nuts. Thanks for joining me. Hey, if you would, please go to joshbrandonmedia.com and follow me on all the social medias you can. And make sure you sign up for my email list. There's going to be a lot of really great information coming out very soon. Check out my new book, Overthinking Everything, Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook. It's available now on my website and everywhere you can find books. And make sure you check out my YouTube. I've got all my videos right there in playlists for you, easy to find for your convenience. Again, follow me everywhere you can. Like, share, and subscribe, and do all the things I need you to do for this series to be successful. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.